This film's subject is Invalides, or in English, Invalids, which are the military wounded. It's basically part of a complex of the Hotel Nacional de Invalides on the left bank, in the 7th arrondissement, House of the Disabled. And it all relates to this day to the military history of France. So a retirement home for war veterans, a hospital to nurse them back to health, and a royal chapel known as the Dome de Invalides. It's really why we're here, because that's a spectacle of the French Baroque. That's also the tallest church building in the city of Paris. And currently it houses the tomb for Napoleon. So in the 1670s, at a certain point, Louis XIV realized that his wealth and his majesty is really predicated on the success of his military might in the field. So to give something back to the wounded coming back from the battlefields, he had Liberal Bruant start the actual hospital complex itself. And that will be found as a very large complex, which actually is much broader in plan type than the chapel we're going to visit here, the Dome de Invalides, which is to the north of the building. So a great southern exposure on a great axis comes down to a big esplanade to the south. And then once you get past the center aspect of the hotel to the north, then before you reach the river, another great grass green esplanade opens up to the north of Paris. You see the model form here. It's got some of the same Baroque trend out of Rome originally and comes up to Paris. At this time, even Bernini himself, one of the great court architects down in Italy, was visiting Paris and Louis XIV on a couple of commissions. So it's really kind of the epicenter of the height of the kingdom of Louis XIV, as well as his architectural prowess. So this is going to be a really signature building for the landscape of the French Baroque. So like we see in other building types, it's a series of classical devices. So one order rises up to a second order, to a cap, to a pediment. And then from there, you've got the stages of the drums of the dome that support the dome up above. So it rises to a very tall height, again, being the tallest ecclesiastical building, and designed by the chapel itself, then by a more principal architect we've heard from before, J.H. Mansart. And we'll put this in parentheses, but a lot of historians think that Mansart's sort of reference point for architectural history beyond the Roman Baroque is the Baroque from his uncle F. Mansart. So not really the design, but certainly a great inspiration for him. Mansart was commissioned to do a chapel to the Bourbon kings, because the kings had been interned at the Basilica of Saint Denis since ancient times. So that necropolis for the monarchs was designed by Francois Mansart to be an addition on the actual site of the Cathedral at Saint Denis, which is outside Paris by about 9 kilometers. What happens here, and the grand extent of the plan, it really extends out to here as more normalized sort of service utility architecture for the workings of the hospital, gets celebrated by the change and shift from the spine that comes down to the old chapel for the militia. And the king said he didn't want to have to go to daily masses with the militia in the same service, so he wanted to have his own private royal chapel here. In fact, it ends up being sort of its own massive temple, dedicated private chapel for the monarch, but ends up being an iconic burial place for Louis XIV. At least that was the intention. So on that site, not a different scale, look at the plan really quick as we move the model over to one side, and we'll see it's got all of our symbolic gestures of that Renaissance into Baroque language, and now refined by the French classicists. So bisecting any square finds you the center of the future circle that's inscribed inside of that. And then side chapels that carve out voids inside the bastion, the material that goes up and supports the articulation of support for that. So everywhere you don't see a big cylindrical shape, there is massive forms of stone and architecture, which are helping to create a tiering of layers and zones, which open up the idea of buttressing for the dome up above. So we'll see that in our perspective, how it all cascades to the crowning point of the cupola up top on the dome. And as I mentioned, it's on a very powerful axis, mostly north-south. And then through the east-west takes you over to principal parts of the gardens that are also in the Renaissance language, which shape off that have patterns you relate to on the lead there. And then Haussmann in the 19th century obviously picks up on these really prominent axes and makes sure those vistas are aligned with his new streets he's designing for the city of Paris a century later. So the plan type is nothing that extraordinary outside of its size itself, and that's one of the passions of Baroque architecture, to use size and form making as like a power play or an indicator of the wealth and dominance of the individual in French history at that time, which is obviously Louis XIV. So we'll get into the sketch here. We'll talk more about its sort of social prominence in the course of French architectural history and social histories. So we'll shift our model over here. We use it as a reference to how we're going to draw that now, that will come and approach it from a little bit off center so we get more of a perspectival view and see a little bit of the right side of it. And then from grade, so that if we tip this, we'll see the dome shy away from us behind that front pediment. So we're about eye height here, which is a little bit taller than that front step, will be our horizon line. And we'll simply draw the entire cubic base first and then pull out the porticos and then set the rotunda on top of that base piece. Put that bad axis there. So basically, just above our ground level, we'll find the stair that rises up. And then there's enough steps so that basically just beyond that height is the height of a person on the site from where we're viewing. So we can carry that horizon line down. So we'll know if we ever find any horizontals that will project back to it, we have to locate them on the vanishing points on this horizon line, well off the page to the right or to the left. But because it's a very tall building, we're actually fairly close to it. We're probably seated on the edge of its, or inside the dry moat that's at the edge of its property now on a sort of a car turnaround area on the boulevard there. So now we're on Invalides property, and this is sort of the farthest you can get away from it. And it's still a very dominant image here, such that we use the third point now for the verticals. If we extend the outside lines of our box here, we'll see that they're going to chase up to a point off the page, very, very high in the sky, but that helps make it seem very tall. If we were to tilt those out and make them parallel in real space, it would flatten it out to a more two-dimensional image. So even the pitch of the outside of the drum of the domes also goes up to that line on a diagonal toward that singular point well off the page. So we'll try to hold on to that to make sure this really soars up above the local shapes of buildings around it. So for instance, a 5-story building is over here on the side adjacent to it, coming down to grade. And on this side, it's a 3-story building. And this line will vanish to its vanishing point over here to the right. And this will vanish to a left vanishing point well over on the off the horizon line over here. So all of our points of reference now are taking the top of the building and rushing them down to this left vanishing point. And the ones are going to come down to our right vanishing point, and the underside of things will go off the page a bit to the right over here. So let's start with the box itself. We're going to go to the outline here and simply draw down that cubic volume to grade on both sides. And then knowing that we've got a point way off here to the left, far off the page, these lines will come down because this corner is closest to us. Just a little bit of hint of cascading down. And the center part of this, now we've got the projecting, very volumetric spatial movement of the columns that aren't just addressed in the skin proper, but they're moving out in tiers. So there's a central tier that has paired columns to it, and then two edge tiers. So in an ABA rhythm, we can drop down the edges and show the overall standing of this element. And then pulling out that even closer to us is the B itself. So A and B, it's actually a 5-part. So if you do A, B, C, B, A, it keeps stepping up closer towards us. So the next one that steps up is the A segment, which comes up and has its edge column that comes down. Over on the right side, its edge column that rides down. So eventually we'll come back and we'll highlight this whole piece to cast shadows and steps back 1, 2 times to the original box form there. This is a great sort of heroic, masterful entry on a huge axis in Paris that celebrates a single individual and their eternal resting place. At least so that was the game plan back then. So to kind of infill some of the architecture, we'll simply twin out the columns up top. So there's a pair there, and they're received by the exact same number of pair below. In this case, they will be the Doric order that supports the Corinthian above. Again, that language can change and shift in terms of the aspirations of the architect for the site. And then that'll extend out to 2 more columns. One's very close to that frontal piece. One's over on the edge of the portico that's pointing out towards us. That's the one that's close, and that's the one that's near the edge. So overall, there's 4 in the center, and then 2 more on each side. And the rule of the game is the columns rise up to the entablature, and then it's stopped by a cornice line, and then rises up as a base. In this case, there's a base for the 2 columns and a base for the 2 columns, and that drops down. So you're rebuilding the base of a new building. And now that's going to project back to our right vanishing point. And then project back to that same right vanishing point. And step over and step over. All the way down to the base and the top of our stair, we'll find those same types of base for the paired columns, the singular column at the edges. And then whenever it's, again, a line going back to our horizon line, it'll vanish back to it. So we get a little bit of depth out of that. And the same is true now for the underside that we'll see. We see a little bit of a depth here of the block of stone, which creates the entablature. And we see more of a depth because we're further from the top deck too. And so that'll give it some type of relief as we build up that skin. Okay, on either side, it's flanked by a couple of tiers of windows, letting some natural light into the space. A little delicate arch on the tops of those, instead of being flat at the top. And then a cornice line, and then a railing line on top of that. This cornice steps down because you go back in space and it continues across the 2 A parts of our rhythm. Again, A, B, C, B, A again. So that stops our first building. We rise it up again, make a heroic entry to the second part of the building with its large archway in the center. And because we're off center, we're not drawing it truly in front of us, we're off to the right because we can see a little bit of the side of the building. We're not going to see the archway up here dead center. It's going to shift over because it's on that back wall. Same is true for the front door here. We don't see the right side of it. It comes down to grade. And the stair comes out and drops down in both directions to the side as well as to the front. So we'll see both sides of it here, the right side of it and the front side of the stair. And now again, because we are off center, normally that center of the dome would be right off of this portico if you're doing an elevation or your perspective's right on axis. We shifted this to create a little more dynamic view. And so it'll appear to be off center, but we know in plan type in real life it is. So there's the shape of our dome. Again, each dome's gonna have its own personality, being purely hemispherical or more elongated. In this case, it's a little bit taller than a pure hemisphere. And we simply round up, because we're well under it, the different types of cylindrical pieces up top. When you get to the crowning element up here, it's rotational play, which is kind of taking the language of the Baroque and having more playful aspects to it. Typically, the openings are right on axis. When it comes to the center opening here, what we see is an actual closure. This is the axis coming right down here. A closure of two columns and then a wall space. So what Mansart does, he rotates the dome as it goes up into the air. So when we come up to the top, you don't look at an arch, you look at a column, and it sits on a rotated square with another spire on top of that. So off axis then, but twinned on either side, are arches that make their way around the dome. As we rotate around it, we'll see the same arch, but we see less of it because of the foreshortening of our information. And then the edge, as it details itself out, and again, those vertical lines will descend and line up to that projection, up to the pitch point of the third point up in the sky. As you wrap around, there are two sets of paired columns that support on the left and two sets of paired columns that support on the right. And at any given point of breaking the top of those columns, we wrap in language of the cylindrical piece that works as the tightening element, where there'd be metal wraps inside there, which would be post tension. So as it's built then and drawn together, in a sense, the dome wants to center and push out as it kind of relaxes. And so the tensile quality of the steel around the rim then would be taut. So it kind of pops the dome back up and makes it more vertical. And you work both compression and tension at the same time for the performance of the dome over time. Another window on axis there, another one on the right over here. And then also when you get to the crown of the dome itself, the idea would be to say a void between the ribs. In this case, Mansart puts a rib right on the axis, sort of hinting at the structure. And those ribs curl around with a certain spacing as they make the way around the 360 dome. And because we're well up beneath this type of pitch up there, we will see the underside, again, a nice dark area here in the open cupola, and then the edges of that rotated square up top. And finding a little crowning ball, and of course the cruciform shape. Okay, so now it's time to kind of articulate the light here. It's difficult to get that throw with the light for the drawing today because it's a very normative flat light where the sun is very powerful and kind of lineal and can highlight things better. So we're going to assume that if this is the true north and south spine, we're going to assume something probably early morning where the sun's coming again diagonally, because if you do it flat in the front or flat to the side, it loses some of the mass. So you can always kind of think of light coming in on a diagonal to hit the site. So south and east would would win the day here. So this is going to be a brighter section of the cylinder and the dome above, and then the portico up front will cast shadows to the left of all of its objects. So our first thing to do is to show some value to some of the spaces that are going to have a different tone just because of their materiality. So the ribs are more gilded as a more shiny, bright gold. And so in between the ribs, it's a darker type of tone of roofing material. And we already have our very dark here inside the cupola above. And then all the fenestration that's letting in the natural light can be filled in as a dark relative to the stone outside. We'll follow that through the whole building, just wash those really quickly. We'll come back in and add more highlight later. And now we're working on the portico because this is brightly lit. And this side also has got some activity of light on it, but we'll help that out by doing value on the side buildings in a minute. But to pull this out and show that, we're going to come first to the whole underside of the portico, which is popping out here, and show the depth of that space with that tone. And then what happens, because the light's coming from above and from this angle, it's also going to cast a shadow from that element. So there's a shade part and the shadow part. So that'll help it make just a hair deeper. And now, because it's directional, it is coming from the right side. There's no shadow cast on this side. It's just the white of the stone, but there is by this column adjacent to it. So we go a little bit stronger there between the two columns and all the sets to there, coming down on the side here. And then this whole piece sits in front. So that gets dark on that side of the pad. Down here and on that side of the base pad too. So that helps to pull this out a little bit. We'll keep carrying that down to every column. So there's a left and right in terms of the attention to the projections shadows. It helps to pull that out a little bit more. And now we'll use a little bit of the sky to help create the grandeur around this. So what we'll do is we'll assume there's a brighter sky over here, which will mean our stonework will be brighter than the whites behind it. To hold that edge. We'll do the same with this edge of this part of the dome up above, and then the opposite side as well. And then to make this really shine up above, we're going to come back in and make the darker edge of the dome up here on the darker side of our cupola. And then leave some of the actual dome piece up here brighter than the rest, right in the center, so it seems like it's being highlighted by the sun in the center of the dome there. So now we can drive the sky just in a wash on the flat edge of your pencil, right up to the edge of the architecture to pop out that white. And then we always want to carry that through so there's a consistency, so it doesn't seem like it's just trapped on one side of the sketch. So we'll take it to the other side of the dome and keep running it off. And it'll dissipate towards the edge of the sketch. So if it's a dark, intrusive storm that's coming from the north and coming toward Paris, we can say then that the clouds might be lower, closer to the horizon as they're about to sort of expel the rains onto the flatlands. So they can be a little bit richer here by the base of the building. The darker we make that, the more that corner of the white stone kind of performs for us. And now our neighboring buildings, this has a darker roof over a distance, but being to show that it's a 5-story building, we can put in little quick sketch windows to show some detail to them going back. Maybe not the entire grid, but enough that it takes you to the ground. So that gives anthropomorphic scale of what a human being would be like at that place back there. If this is the first story entry, this is the side of a human being on the site, adjacent to that tower. And then walking back, they diminish as they walk in the foreground to get to that building, walk in the entry level there. And then the side building takes off next to it. And so that's enough. It's a tight enough aspect so they could probably go a little bit darker toward the grade there. And that's the walkway around the Invalides that takes you back to the now military museum of what the hospital tactics were back then when the French invented triage in the war, so that they basically took the hospital to the field, and when it was beyond the caseload there, they'd bring them back to the Invalides here for recuperation. And then regardless of what this building is, it does have a little bit of a mansard roof to it, but you want to make it dark right next to the edge of Louis XIV's resting place. And that it's an awful lot of weight, that being the tallest ecclesiastical building. So we want to sit that down on the earth and make sure there's value that will hold that building in space. So if this is a light gravel walkway that takes you to the central stair, then we'll leave that white, but then the grass esplanade on either side of it is a darker tone, so we can have that come right up to the base of the building here. On both sides to the foot of the individual over here. And then make sure that edge gets darkest right by where it sits the building down. And it's not as if that's a choice, that's actually what we see, because as we see more and more green and less space, it actually makes the tone appear darker to our eyes too, even though we know it's the same color all the way through. And that little change there then says that we're bringing all this stone down from the vertical thrust, and then we're going to have the earth expand it left and right to distribute that load. And so it's important to have that dark tone down there. So now we get a fine pencil, one of the ones we sharpened before the start of this, and we'll start to talk about the final details. And we can push back into all the windows now, knowing that the base of all the windows there, it's a little bit darker at the top, showing the thickness of the stone before the glazing is set back. And because the light's coming from one side, it's casting a little bit of shadow on this side compared to the other. And that helps give some clarity to the depth of the building. We can come on the left side of all the architecture and do a stronger line work on the edge of that classical language. That cut down. So the left side of all the columns is the darkest. And sketching, always leave them a little bit thicker than real life, because you can always make them thinner, but you can't make them brighter if you've already got the media down. So don't rush into making them skinnier, just kind of go on the edge of them. That'll make them read better. Come up to the base of all the architecture points and make sure if they're holding space behind them, we delineate them a little bit better. And then we're well under the arches up here, so we'll see even a greater darkness to it. And then the little entablature lines, those columns are supporting, will throw their shadow as it wraps around. Now, right when you're doing the edge of the dome, the critical part is that corner. We see what we're thinking we see is half of it. So you don't want to necessarily stop right at the halfway point. You want to wrap the edge around so that the detail goes around that corner. So to make it really spin in space, that last little bit of that hook really kind of articulates the idea of this thing revolving in space. And then at each point between the arches, there's some statuary up here, which ornaments the dome. So on the edge over here, you'll see the profile one against the sky. Same is true over here. And the idea that the Baroque is very expressive and very literal in terms of ornamentation. Up top, when you see the eyelets that for the dome up above, that the actual eyelet is framed over with by a military helmet. So there's characters and ideals towards the ornamentation that relates to its content, and that's typically a Baroque ideal too. You make your way around there, and they'll be in that arc. So make sure you finish those kind of moving around the skin of the dome. And then one last element, because this whole piece has cast its shadow on that. Now the B section casts a shadow on C over here. So all the way down here toward the grade, we'll have another cast shadow, which pulls the entire portico off the grade a bit. And that sits on a plinth here at the same height of the stair. And then our front tiers of stepping from A to B. Then when we come to the final aspect over here, it actually steps one more time just in the lower level, though, and moves itself out to that last column on the side here. So it's a very playful composition in that lineage from Solomon de Brasse to Jacques Lemercier to Francois Mansart to J.H. Mansart, and the articulate Louis Laveau we'll see next at the École Militaire, excuse me, the École Four Nations. So there's a whole array of just juxtaposition of using these classical devices to complete the language of the structure of the Baroque era.